Good evening and welcome to one more lecture in our Alumni Leadership Lecture Series. The speaker today is Rathin Roy. He's BTech 1969 Electrical, and I have known Rathin, I think, ever since I came back to IIT Madras in 2004. He and I have worked quite closely together with Wilgrow, who is an NGO that's located in IIT Madras Research Park, which incubates grassroots innovators. And we both were on the board of directors of Wilgrow. Rathin still is. I just left the board, and Ashwin Mahalingam is now the IIT Madras representative on the board. I've enjoyed working with Rathin over the years. He's a very engaging conversationalist and seems to know pretty much everything about everything, and has a very interesting and entertaining way of communicating his knowledge, which is very important. He always excels in interactive sessions, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'm sure he will enjoy that also. I think you have all seen his bio. I don't want to go through it again, but as the headline says, he's a facilitator of learning, strategic thinking, and change. I'll leave the rest up to him. Rathin.
Good evening. I'm getting to be that age when people begin to suspect that you might have some wisdom rubbing off, partly because of your experience, partly because your achievements, and mostly because you survived to this age. And the risky thing, of course, is that sometimes when you hear that often enough, you actually believe that you have something to share. So when Dean Nagarajan asked me to share some thoughts with you, I thought I'll take a crack and see if it makes sense to you folks. Now, I must warn you that I come from literally the previous generation, most probably in the same category as your parents. But bear out, because what I'm going to talk to you about is basically some skills and competencies that all through my working life I tried to gain and I looked for in others who worked with me and who I had to hire, and rarely found it because it's often ignored in our traditional education systems, and yet it seems to be very high on the list of those who are trying to get you to work for them. Right. I see most of us have certain talents, certain gifts, if you want to think of it that way. And over the years, we pick up a little education here, a little skill there. We generate some knowledge. And we see these as assets upon which we can build and try to achieve some of the outcomes we are interested in. But sometimes, some of these assets can actually work against you. Let me take a case in point, talking to people in IIT. Whether we like to publicly say it or not, we sort of grudgingly accept the fact that perhaps we are a little above the average when it comes to intelligence. And sometimes we take it serious enough that we get a little arrogant about this and stop listening because we assume that we know and others don't necessarily know. And what you lose in the process is an understanding of who you have to work with, and this can actually work against you in a work situation. Because there we are not testing you for intelligence, we are testing you for your emotional intelligence and your ability to work with others. So it's things like that. So what I thought I would focus on very briefly, and then we can open it up for questions and more interaction, is to talk about some skills and competencies which actually help us to better utilize the natural talents, knowledge, and skills that we acquire in institutions and educational places. So what are these three? I'm going to focus just on three. It's not a limit. And I hope by the end of this talk, I don't believe I'll achieve anything more than letting you know that such areas exist and deserve your attention. If I can provoke you into thinking about it, I would have considered myself reasonably successful, because there isn't time to tell you how to do it. But that's going to be left to you to figure out along the way, because there are no institutions who will give this to you. You either figure it yourself or it doesn't happen. The three areas that I'm going to touch upon, very broadly speaking. The first one is dealing with, embracing, and living with complexity, taken in a much larger sense, in a human sense. The second one is, how do you learn to understand collectiveness, or working together as different from working alone, which doesn't require too much expertise. But working together does require expertise. And the last is the kind of navigation device that you need, because all through your life you have choices to make. And the question is, how do you choose? What are the instruments that you can use to navigate better? Now, while I'm talking to you about this, you'll notice that many of these things that I'm talking about are, to tell you the truth, stupidly obvious and simple. But the problem is that while they are stupidly obvious and simple, they are not very easy to acquire, because they are usually counterintuitive to what you're doing, and they are definitely more difficult to practice. But from hard experience, I can assure you that you will benefit as a person and as an achiever by picking up some of these skills on your own, which is the only place you can pick it up. Let me begin with the first one. Now, I've led a pretty nomadic life. I don't know how many of you have looked at the little biodata that I spread around. But even when it comes to education, I went from electrical engineering to biomedical engineering, which is a reasonably understandable step. But then from there, I went into public health, and from public health into rural development to political science, which is bad enough, but that is just the education part. When it came to work, I've spent most of my life with the UN, working in natural systems management, natural resource management, mainly in forestry and fisheries. And then graduating from that into policy and development. But the pattern that I saw, going from left to right as it were, was the increase in complexity. The inability to predict, the uncertainty of what your actions will lead to, the surprises, and the need to continuously learn and change tack. And the further I went away from engineering, which was complex in and of itself, the worse it got. Because the one ingredient that came in more and more to play was people. And no matter what subject you're dealing with or what work you're doing, unfortunately you can't avoid not dealing with people. And that's where the problems begin. When I started working in natural resources management and fisheries, we were working with small-scale fishing communities around the world, trying to get them to manage their fisheries better. And it was absolutely maddening because of the number of different stakeholders involved. An average fishery chain, from the person who catches the fish to the person who eats the fish, can have 30 to 40 different types of stakeholders: boat owners, laborers, skilled fishermen, master fishermen, unloaders, first auction, second auction, middlemen, so on and so forth, credit providers, marketing agents, and the chain is endless. So when we started managing and helping these people to manage fisheries, the first thing we realized was you can't manage fisheries. Because if you leave fisheries alone, they are brilliant at managing themselves. Most natural systems need absolutely no management. So what we had to manage was the people who interfere with natural systems. So we were working with people. And the first problem that we faced, and this is where I talked about the counterintuitiveness, all through your education, school, college, wherever, when somebody asks you a question, there is an implicit belief that there is an answer. More important, there is a right answer for which you get credit. And it was deeply disappointing in our work because we found that there is no such thing called a right answer. Everyone had their own perception of what the problem was, and everyone had their own perception what the solution was. And this was not imagination, it was real. One person's problem was often another person's solution. When we inadvertently started giving people motors and engines for their boats so that they could fish more and increase their productivity, the only thing that changed was the production increased, but the market, which was captured already by the middlemen, gave them the same price, and they had already invested more in their engines. So we actually impoverished them by trying to help them. So the solution for the fishermen turned out to be a problem for them, and the solution for the fishermen was an incredible solution for the middlemen who profited hugely from this process. And that's when we first came to realize that you had to negotiate your problems and negotiate your solutions. And this is not very far-fetched. You don't have to be a fisherman to face this problem. You could be facing this problem with boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, subordinates, bosses, everyone. You have to negotiate the understanding of the problem that you are trying to solve, otherwise you end up solving the wrong problem. Why does this happen? It happens because we have too many elements in this system, which is problematic enough, but they are interconnected, interactive, interdependent, which makes it worse and more complex, and they change in time, which makes it damnably complex. And worse, some of these elements happen to be people, which means they are perceiving things differently, they are building meanings from their perceptions differently, and because the meanings are different, they are behaving differently. And they also change in time. And you end up in a sort of a intellectual gridlock where you can't get out of because everyone is talking differently, saying different things. If you don't believe me, switch on Times Now every evening at 9 o'clock, listen to Arnab Goswami and his team, and you'll understand what intellectual gridlock is. At the end of the session, you're wondering, what the hell went on? You have no clue because everyone looked at it differently. So, what happens? You have uncertainty, unpredictability, and you end up in a bit of a mess. But of course, being good engineers, some of us say, hey, we'll outlearn the system. As long as you have enough information, you can sort it out. Here's the catch. You'll never have enough information. For two reasons. One, you don't know enough and perhaps will never know enough. Or worse, you know so much that you don't know which parts of what you know should be used. If this hasn't struck you, ponder it a little bit and you'll realize how serious this problem is. You can't beat the system in that way.